Jasmine Crockett strode into the courtroom like a force of nature, a woman forged in the fires of injustice, tempered by years as a tireless defender of the downtrodden. Her reputation, honed first as a defense attorney in the Texas heat and later as a determined congresswoman, preceded her. Today, however, was not a routine battle. Today, she faced not only a notorious fraud case, but the very embodiment of corrupted power, Judge Victor Ramsey. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled by an audience hungry for justice or scandal. There were reporters in the back, jurors fidgeting nervously, and a cadre of defense attorneys exchanging smug glances. Judge Ramsey, known as much for his biting sarcasm as for his iron-fisted control over his court, sat behind the bench, a picture of self-assured authority. He flipped through a legal pad with deliberate nonchalance, his pen tapping a rhythm that betrayed a man waiting to deliver judgment on both sides of the case. The case itself was a bombshell, a multi-million-dollar charity fraud scheme that had devastated families, leaving homeless shelters in shambles while a slick businessman named Daniel Hargrove reaped riches. Hargrove, draped in an expensive suit and oozing entitlement, had allegedly diverted $4.2 million in donations intended for the Hope Shelter Network into offshore accounts. The money that should have provided beds, food, and dignity was now funding lavish lifestyles, private jets, and beachfront properties. Jasmine had been brought in as a special prosecutor precisely because of her unyielding reputation for fairness and her refusal to back down, no matter how formidable the opponent. As she took her place at the prosecution table, smoothing her blazer and setting down meticulously organized files, the air in the courtroom shifted perceptibly. Judge Ramsey did not even look her way. Instead, he fixed his eyes on his legal pad. His pen's rhythmic tapping was almost mocking, as if counting down the moments until the next opportunity to belittle her. The murmur of the crowd, the hushed anticipation of the jurors, and the snickering undertones from Hargrove's legal team filled the silence. Finally, Judge Ramsey cleared his throat and raised his head. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Jasmine as he leaned forward, peering over his glasses. "Miss Crockett," he drawled, voice laced with condescension, "I hope you've brought something more entertaining than your usual sob stories. I'd hate to fall asleep before lunch." A ripple of laughter passed through Hargrove's side of the room. The defense attorneys exchanged amused, knowing looks, as if they were witnessing the beginning of a spectacle. Jasmine's face remained impassive. She'd weathered far worse than snide remarks in court. "Your Honor," she said steadily, voice measured yet resolute, "this case is not about entertainment. It's about accountability. The evidence will speak for itself." Before she could continue, Judge Ramsey cut her off. "Evidence?" he scoffed, leaning back as though settling in for a comedy show. "You mean the pile of paper you're about to bore us with? Spare me, Miss Crockett. I've seen better fiction in my grandson's bedtime stories." A few gasps escaped from the gallery, and the atmosphere shifted. This was no mere verbal joust. It was a public slap, intended to diminish her resolve. But Jasmine's grip on her pen tightened, her eyes fixed on the judge with unwavering determination. She knew he was trying to unnerve her, to make her seem small, and without raising her voice, she continued, "With all due respect, Your Honor, the only fiction here is the defendant's claim that he didn't steal from the people who need help the most. The facts, the records, and the testimonies will expose the truth." At that, Ramsey's smirk faltered for a heartbeat, a hint of something like uncertainty flickering in his eyes before he recovered. "Please," he scoffed, dismissing her words with a casual wave of his hand. "You and your bleeding heart crusades. Get to the point or I'll assume you're just here to waste my time." A tense silence followed. Jurors exchanged anxious glances. Even Hargrove, who until now had lounged confidently in his tailored suit, seemed to shift in his seat as if sensing the imminent storm. Jasmine took a slow, steadying breath. She had faced bullies before, men who thought their power rendered them invincible, but never had she encountered a force so brazen in its abuse of authority. She opened her folder with deliberate calm and slid out a stack of bank records. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A." she announced. These are the financial statements clearly showing that $4.2 million in donations from the Hope Shelter Network was rerouted to an offshore account directly tied to Mr. Hargrove. With a practiced motion, she activated the projector. The numbers appeared on the screen, cold, undeniable figures that painted a picture of systematic fraud. Judge Ramsey's voice, sharp with irritation, broke the moment. If you'll look here, Miss Crockett, do you really think I need a math lesson? I'm not an accountant. The defense team chuckled, a sound that was more desperate than genuine amusement. Jasmine paused for a moment, letting the silence emphasize her next words. No, Your Honor, she said steadily, meeting his eyes with unwavering resolve. I think it is your duty as a judge to hear the facts, rather than dismiss them with a quip. The courtroom fell into a heavy hush. The weight of her words reverberated around the room, a quiet but powerful declaration that this was not a matter of trivial banter, but of grave injustice. Judge Ramsey's eyes narrowed, and his fingers began to tap the bench more rapidly, betraying his inner agitation. Careful, Miss Crockett, he warned in an icy tone. I do not take kindly to lectures in my courtroom, and I do not take kindly to mockery when lives hang in the balance, she replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. The gallery stirred anew as reporters scribbled down every word, knowing they were witnessing an unprecedented clash of wills. Ramsey leaned forward, his smirk twisting into something darker and more dangerous. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Riding in to save the day with your little charts and graphs? This isn't Congress, Miss Crockett. It is my domain. For a brief moment, the tension in the room was palpable. Jasmine did not flinch. Then act like it, she said simply, her tone a quiet challenge that made the entire courtroom hold its breath. In that frozen moment, the air between them was charged with unspoken threats and unyielding. Judge Ramsey opened his mouth as if to respond, but before he could utter a word, Jasmine continued. Your Honor, if I may proceed, these records are not just numbers on a page. They are the proof of a crime. They unequivocally demonstrate that Mr. Hargrove redirected funds intended for basic human needs into the coffers of his own greed. Allegations, Miss Crockett, Ramsey interrupted dismissively. That is all I see. Flimsy allegations from a woman who apparently craves the spotlight. Jasmine's eyes flashed, but she maintained her composure. Without missing a beat, she flipped to the next page in her file. Let us now consider something concrete. This is a signed affidavit from a whistleblower within Mr. Hargrove's company, a person brave enough to expose the inner workings of this corruption. It explicitly states that Mr. Hargrove personally ordered the fraudulent transfers. She held up the document for all to see, letting the gravity of its contents sink in. Would you like to dismiss this evidence as well, Your Honor? She challenged. Ramsey's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he merely waved a dismissive hand. Submit it if you must. Jasmine set the affidavit down with deliberate care, her mind racing through the implications. Something was off in the judge's demeanor. His hostility was not merely procedural, but seemed laced with personal vendetta. He was defensive, almost desperate, to shut her down. She'd seen instances before of judges protecting their own interests, but this was different. This was personal. Her eyes darted briefly to Hargrove, who now watched Ramsey with an intensity that bordered on fear. Then, meeting the judge's eyes once more, she pressed on. Your Honor, I move to introduce additional evidence that corroborates the affidavit. Before she could articulate the details, Ramsey snapped, Denied. His voice was clipped, almost trembling with a barely concealed fury. Jasmine raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor never wavering. But, Your Honor, are you refusing to let me present evidence before you've even reviewed it? She pressed, her tone equal parts incredulity and determination. A long pause followed, a pause that seemed to stretch on indefinitely as every eye in the courtroom fixed on the exchange. Finally, in a voice that sounded less confident than before, Ramsey declared, I am refusing to waste any more time. His words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Jasmine allowed herself a slow nod, her mind already racing through her next move. Interesting, she murmured almost to herself. Without allowing the moment to slip away, she turned back to the projector. Then let us move to Exhibit B, she announced. This is a wire transfer receipt signed by Mr. Hargrove and countersigned by a third party. As the slide changed, the entire room went silent. The signature beneath the transfer, a bold, unmistakable mark, read, Victor Ramsey. In that instant, the atmosphere in the courtroom transformed from tense to electric. Gasps echoed from the gallery. The scrape of chairs and shuffling feet punctuated the shocked silence. Hargrove's face drained of color. His lead attorney started to stand, voice rising in objection. "Objection! This is—" he began, only to be cut off sharply by Jasmine. "Sit down," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. The room obeyed as if in awe of the moment unfolding. Jasmine turned her unwavering gaze toward Ramsey, whose hands now gripped the edge of the bench as if in a futile attempt to steady himself. "Your Honor," she said steadily, "could you explain why your signature appears on a document authorizing the transfer of funds that were, by all accounts, stolen from those who desperately needed them?" For a heartbeat, Ramsey's mouth opened in shock before snapping shut. His eyes flitted to the exit and back to Jasmine, searching for a way out. "That is inadmissible," he stammered, voice hoarse with indignation. "How so?" Jasmine pressed softly. "Forged," he finally spat out, the single word heavy with denial and desperation. "A fabrication," he added quickly. Jasmine tilted her head, her expression calm but unyielding. "Is it because we have a forensic analyst on standby ready to testify that the signature is in fact authentic?" she asked quietly, letting the implication linger in the air. The gallery buzzed louder now, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The silence was shattered only by the rapid, agitated tapping of Judge Ramsey's gavel as he banged it on the bench. "Order!" he bellowed, though the sound was tinged with desperation rather than authority. "This is outrageous!" "No!" Jasmine said firmly as she stepped closer to the bench. "What is truly outrageous is a judge who mocks justice while he himself is knee-deep in corruption." Her words, delivered in a calm but cutting tone, left Ramsey's face flushed and angry red, his knuckles whitening as he clutched the gavel. "You're out of line, Miss Crockett," he declared, his voice rising in a futile attempt to regain control. "And you are out of time." With measured deliberation, Jasmine reached into her briefcase and produced a small digital recorder. Placing it firmly on the table, she addressed the court. "This is a recording obtained legally, a wiretap between Mr. Hargrove and an unnamed official discussing the matter in explicit terms." She pressed the play button. The recording filled the courtroom with Ramsey's own voice, crackling over the speaker. "She's getting too close. Bury it. I don't care how." Then, with a pause that made every listener lean forward, the voice continued, "Then, Hargrove, you said this was handled, Vic." The impact was immediate. Shock rippled through the courtroom as every attendee realized that the judge had not only been involved, but was complicit in the fraud. Without missing a beat, Jasmine turned to the gallery and said, "The truth, as always, has a way of emerging." The silence was shattered by the sound of heavy boots as the courtroom door swung open. Two uniformed officers entered briskly, their presence immediately commanding attention. One of them approached the bench and, in a firm yet measured tone, declared, "Judge Victor Ramsey, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice." At that moment, chaos erupted. Reporters scrambled to capture every second, jurors gasped in disbelief, and Hargrove's legal team was rendered mute by the unfolding scandal. Ramsey leaped to his feet, his expression a tumult of anger, fear, and disbelief. "This is absurd!" he protested vehemently, but his words were cut off as one of the officers, with clinical precision, produced a pair of handcuffs. "Silence!" the officer ordered firmly, snapping the cuffs around Ramsey's wrists. The metallic click echoed like a death knell throughout the chamber. Ramsey's smug grin, which had been his armor of arrogance, was wiped away, replaced by a look of stunned terror and humiliation as he struggled fruitlessly against his restraints. "You'll regret this, Crockett," he hissed through gritted teeth, his voice a mixture of venom and despair. Jasmine met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "I don't think so," she replied, her voice as steady as ever. "Justice does not bend for bullies." As the officers led the disgraced judge toward the side exit, his protests faded into the murmurs of an awestruck crowd. Jasmine remained seated for a long, heavy moment, absorbing the gravity of what had just occurred. There was no triumph in her expression, only a measured, resolute calm that spoke of battles fought for years, of systems broken, and the fierce determination to mend them. Across the room, Daniel Hargrove's face turned ashen. His eyes, once brimming with arrogant confidence, now betrayed panic. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering frantically, the words tumbling out in a mixture of fear and regret. His attorney shook his head, clearly at a loss in the wake of the sudden turn of events. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice slicing through the tense silence. "Mr. Hargrove," she addressed him directly, "you may want to start talking. Your safety net has just been dismantled. I suggest you cooperate before this court uncovers every hidden detail." Hargrove swallowed hard, his previously unshakable bravado now replaced by desperation. I need a deal," he stammered, his voice barely audible amid the rising clamor. "Then you'd better make it good," Jasmine replied coolly. The courtroom settled into a stunned hush as Judge Ramsey, now a figure of disgrace, disappeared through the side door. The once imposing judge's bench now stood empty, a stark symbol of power undone and justice finally reclaiming it. For several long minutes no one spoke. The only sound was the murmur of reporters dictating their thoughts to their recorders and the soft rustle of paper as jurors exchanged looks of disbelief. Finally, Jasmine gathered her composure, adjusted the papers on her table, and addressed the room once more. "I believe that the trial must continue," she said firmly, "for the sake of all those who trusted the system to protect them. We will uncover every shred of evidence, and no one, not even those in positions of authority, will be allowed to obstruct the truth." Her words resonated deeply with the assembled crowd. Reporters rushed to file their stories, their cameras flashing as they captured every moment of what would undoubtedly become a landmark case, a reckoning that transcended the courtroom and spoke to the very heart of a city in desperate need of change. In the ensuing hours, as the trial moved forward, details began to emerge that painted a far broader picture of corruption than anyone had imagined. Witnesses came forward one by one to testify about a network of deceit that spanned not just one crooked judge, but an entire cabal of officials who had turned a blind eye to the suffering of the people. Among the witnesses was a former employee of Hargrove's company, a timid individual at first, but emboldened by the undeniable proof now on record, who recounted how he had been ordered to transfer funds under duress and how he had witnessed the conspiracies firsthand. In a hushed tone that belied the gravity of his testimony, he described secret meetings in dimly lit conference rooms where powerful men exchanged envelopes stuffed with cash and promises of immunity. His account, corroborated by additional documentation introduced by Jasmine, began to dismantle the narrative that had once allowed the powerful to operate above the law. Every new piece of evidence, every reluctant confession, served to chip away at the Jasmine's own testimony was a study in quiet fortitude. In her opening statement, she spoke not only of the numbers on the projector screen, but also of the human cost of the crimes committed by Hargrove and his cohorts. She recounted the stories of families who had lost everything. A mother forced to choose between feeding her children and paying the rent, an elderly man left to wander the streets in search of shelter, and a young single father whose dreams of a better life had been crushed by greed. With each word, her passion and commitment to justice shone through. transforming the courtroom into a crucible where truth was forged in the fires of righteous indignation. Even as the trial progressed, Judge Ramsey's fall from grace was a catalyst for wider reform. Across the city, whispers of similar corruption began to surface. Activists, emboldened by Jasmine's unwavering stance, organized protests and demanded accountability from all those who had abused their power. In late-night news segments and front-page headlines, her name became synonymous with the triumph of justice over corruption. The case, initially seen as just another legal proceeding, evolved into a turning point, a moment when the people reclaimed their faith in the system. For days after the dramatic courtroom showdown, Jasmine worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She met with forensic analysts, combed through mountains of evidence, and coordinated with federal investigators who had taken an interest in the case. Every step of the process was marked by her meticulous attention to detail, a quality that had earned her both the respect and the ire of those who sought to maintain the status quo. In quieter moments, when the weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm her, Jasmine found solace in memories of her early career. She recalled the long nights spent in the cramped offices of a small legal aid clinic in Texas, where she had fought tooth and nail to defend the rights of those who had nowhere else to turn. Those experiences had taught her that the truth, however obscured by layers of deception, always had a way of emerging when given the chance. And on that fateful day, in that packed courtroom, she had provided that chance. As the trial reached its climax, the full extent of the conspiracy was laid bare. More evidence emerged, linking high-ranking officials to a sprawling network of bribery and cover-ups. Testimonies from unexpected quarters, a disgruntled former judge, a whistleblower from a government agency, and even a mid-level bureaucrat whose conscience would no longer allow him to remain silent, formed a mosaic of corruption that was as damning as it was intricate. Each witness, each document, added a layer of undeniable truth to the narrative that Jasmine had painstakingly built from the fragments of broken promises and stolen funds. The courtroom, which had once been a stage for mockery and intimidation, transformed into an arena of accountability. The jurors, their expressions a mix of shock and determination, absorbed every detail. The public, watching from beyond the courtroom doors, was riveted by the unfolding drama. A drama that was not simply about one judge's fall from grace, but about a systemic failure that could no longer be ignored. In the end, as the jury retired to deliberate, Jasmine took a moment to reflect on the journey that had led her to this point. The glare of the projector, the stinging words exchanged in rapid succession, and the overwhelming sense of responsibility, all of it had coalesced into a single, defining moment. The courtroom drama was more than a trial. It was a reckoning for an entire system that had once been impervious to criticism. The verdict, when it finally came, was met with a mixture of relief and somber determination. Justice, though delayed and marred by the machinations of the powerful, had finally been served. In the weeks and months that followed, reforms were introduced, investigations were launched, and a new chapter in the fight against corruption was written. One that would be remembered for its courage, its tenacity. As Jasmine Crockett walked out of the courtroom for the last time that day, she did so with the quiet dignity of a warrior who had fought for what was right, regardless of the cost. There was no celebratory fanfare, only the steady, resolute sound of footsteps echoing in a corridor that now symbolized hope and change. The city, still reeling from the shock of the day's events, began to murmur its approval. People talked of her bravery in hushed tones over coffee and on crowded sidewalks. The story of the fallen judge and the triumph of justice quickly spread, becoming a beacon for those who had long felt marginalized and betrayed. In the end, what had begun as a seemingly routine case had transformed into a landmark moment in the city's history. Jasmine Crockett had not only dismantled a corrupt institution, but had also ignited a spark that promised to light the way toward a more equitable future. Her battle in that courtroom was not just a personal victory, it was a victory for every voice that had been silenced, every hope that had been crushed by greed, and every soul that had dared to dream of a fairer society. And so, as the sun set on that turbulent day, casting long shadows over a city on the cusp of transformation, Jasmine's words echoed in the minds of all who had witnessed the spectacle. Justice does not bend for bullies. In that simple truth lay the promise of tomorrow, a tomorrow where accountability was not optional, and where the voices of the many would always triumph over the arrogance of